So let's not start competing to be first. Let's compete to be the first with the real content. The concept of breaking news is broken. I think in the age of social media, you cannot win a scoop on breaking news. Where you will win a scoop is by giving context that lets people understand the chaos that's going on.
Welcome to the Innovators series, featuring leaders in the information industry whose outlooks have propelled them to the leading edge of data, mobile, and community engagement. The Innovators series is brought to you by the College of Journalism and Communications at the University of Florida and the Knight Foundation. With tonight's guest, here's Bridget Grogan.
Hello and welcome to the Innovators series. Our guest today is Mark Little, founder and CEO of Storyful, the world's first social media news agency. Storyful works with some of the biggest news organizations and social networks in the world to discover and verify compelling social media content. Mark founded Storyful in 2010. It was acquired by News Corp in 2013. And earlier this year, Storyful entered into an agreement with Facebook to power the Facebook Newswire. Mark has more than 20 years of experience in journalism. He was an award-winning foreign correspondent for the Irish national TV station, RTE. And Mark, thank you for joining us for this discussion this evening.
Thank you.
Let's begin with Storyful to give the audience an idea of how this came about, the what and the why. How did you get from journalist to Storyful?
So I was a foreign correspondent, as you say, and I went to all of the post 9/11 era for journalists who are foreign correspondents was a tumultuous time. You were going to places like Afghanistan and Iraq and telling a story. But there was also something very strange about it. It wasn't very authentic. I remember going to Iraq in 2003. We paid the equivalent of $12,000 for all the excess baggage that we brought with us. Our chemical weapons kits and our cameras and our bulletproof vests. We got there and I realized in retrospect, with a camera phone and some connectivity on a laptop, I could probably do the same job with considerable ease. And in 2009, there were protests in Iran. And I remember seeing 17-year-old kids who were out in the streets documenting this incredible event because they were connected to social networks, they had the capacity to tell a story. And I went, oh my God, it's all changed. Me as a foreign correspondent, I no longer have the monopoly on news. I used to be that about a printing press or a satellite dish, I was the person who produced the news. Now it's ordinary people. I'm no longer talking to a passive audience at 9 p.m. at night or in the morning paper. Everything has changed. And it was a huge, for me, a threat and a shock, but also an opportunity. If we could find a way to partner with this new audience who are empowered to produce stories, if we could find the stories worth telling and the amazing amount of content that we're creating, what a change that would be. So I thought, well, if I was to form the AP or Reuters today, without all the legacy issues, what would it look like? And hopefully Storyful is the product. And I tell the story about Iran, but it was actually truly Michael Jackson's death. I was at a wedding in Ireland on the banks of the River Shannon, and I saw all these 20-somethings with their phones gathering around, and they said, Michael Jackson is dead. And about 40 minutes later, I'm on the dance floor with my mother, 65-year-old. We were dancing to Thriller. And it's I'm hopefully that's not recorded on camera. But it was 15 minutes before the LA Times reported officially his death. And we in Ireland at a wedding were dancing in tribute to his music. And I remember thinking afterwards, wow, that's the way news is being consumed. And journalists haven't caught up to that fact. Can I help them? So that's how the idea was born.
Okay. Now, as far as verification is concerned, let's give the audience some sense of the magnitude of some of the challenges that you faced with Storyful. One example that I think of top of mind would be the shooting down of Malaysia Airlines flight MH17. Information coming in fast and furious in a very tumultuous time in a chaotic region. How do you get to the truth?
So the first thing we have to realize, the foundation principle of our organization is that every news event creates a community. So at the beginning of the Arab Spring, for example, we remember in Tunisia seeing this hashtag in Arabic which said Sidi Bouzid. Now, no one knew what that meant, but we translated and realized it was a town where a fruit seller called Mohammed Bouazizi had set himself on fire in protest. That was the beginning of the Arab Spring. We could find that 3-4 weeks before the rest of the world had woken up to it. And we watched this community develop around that hashtag and that conversation on Twitter. We started to analyze it, watch the velocity, the way they talked, and we could pick up all the signals coming from the wisdom in the crowd. And that's how it works. We basically, in something like the tragic story where the Malaysian airliner was shot down, there's a fog of war, there's competing claims, the Russians are talking against the Ukrainians. We plug into the community that knows something about the language, the landscape, the munitions being used, and we all talk in real time through Twitter, through different platforms like Google Plus have sponsored Storyful to have an open newsroom where we'll say, we don't know, what's the accent in that video? We had one example where we could identify a Russian convoy because we could hear a traffic report in the background, and someone came in, jumped in and said, yeah, they're saying this is the location. And so when you suddenly realize the potential of finding people who know something about language and dialect and the armaments, and we finally found, in this case, a trail of social media messages that had been deleted by one of the commanders of the pro-Russian groups, where he admitted the progress of these anti-aircraft barrage, and they were retrieved and held by somebody who passed them on to us. And so it's a forensic investigative journalism, almost like if Woodward and Bernstein reverted everything they did, and instead of deep throat, they had someone publicly shouting from the rooftops, this has happened. And that's why, for me, this is the golden age of storytelling, because suddenly we as journalists are no longer the only people who get to tell you the truth. We are now managers of this abundance of fact and information. If only we could look and listen to the right people, then we have something very special on our hands.
Mm-hmm. There is one challenge, though, in all of that. We are all
just
hardwired.
One?
There's one, only one, and this is it. We're hardwired to be first. And the verification process takes time. How do you balance? You're a journalist, you're a verifier. How do you balance the challenge of meeting both of those demands?
There's one, unavoidable fact. If you try to be first in the age of social media, you'll be more often wrong than first. And so I don't know if you guys watched last weekend when the Clintons went to the Iowa steak fry, right? There were 200 journalists gathered around them to record a non-event. None of them got a better story than the others, but all they wanted was to have, up breaking, Clintons eat steak.
Right.
And our concept of breaking news has become so detached from reality that I think it's time to look at this kind of breaking strap lines, move up when something happens, and just forget about that. Because in the end of the day, it's already happened, the news. It's broken on social media, someone's seen it. So let's not start competing to be first, let's compete to be the first with the real content. So a breaking news organization competes for the first 10 minutes. I'm really interested in after that, as the first image, video, testimony arrives. We really need to watch that and see how we can develop. The Boston bombing was a classic example of that tragedy, where the news organizations were listening to Twitter and Reddit like a police scanner, and forgetting that it's only a tip sheet, it's not a publication. So I think the concept of breaking news is broken. I think in the age of social media, you cannot win a scoop on breaking news. Where you will win a scoop is by giving context that lets people understand the chaos that's going on.
With regard to verification, you have said no one is taking this seriously. What do you mean by that? What are your concerns?
I think we're growing much more accustomed to the idea that we have to be as good about stopping stories as breaking stories. So what I mean by that is, I'll give you an example. Last year there was a tweet went out from the AP which said Barack Obama has been injured. There's a bomb attack in the White House. And the stock market, and you can actually see the graph, just plunged because everyone believed it. Now, it took us 40 seconds to prove that was incorrect. It was a hack of the account for a variety of reasons. And I think that was one of those moments when everyone realized, actually, a part of the competitive advantage for every journalist is to stop stories. And this is not in our culture. So we, in our newsroom, we high-five this moment we think we've stopped something. And I think we've got to get used to that more. And we haven't got to that point where we realize our job is not to be the first to tell you, but to be the first to, give you the truth, which is sounds like a distinction, a semantic distinction. It's not. So I think everyone knows they have to do this, but it's like Christmas. We're all in favor of it, How many people are investing resources within their newsrooms in doing this on a kind of a scaled basis? Not a lot. And even worse is the way that we try credit and compensate the uploaders of citizen video, which doesn't exist at all. And you'll still see, credit YouTube, like credit telephone.
Right.
It means nothing, and we've got to grow up because the industry right now is using so much user content that we risk destroying a really interesting departure in our craft.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about user-generated content. It really has forever changed the face of journalism. So much of what we put out now is coming from, as you said, the creators of the content used to be our audience, and now they are the creators of the content. How has that changed the industry in terms of its output or its mission?
I think, there was this revolutionary shift happened 6 years ago that I would say is up there with like Marconi and Gutenberg and Logie Baird and Ted Turner with cable in the 80s, right? There's this moment that changed about the time the camera phones connected with social networks around 2006, 2007. The history books will record that as not just a disruption, but an absolute dislocation of everything. Because in that moment, the means of production of creating news changed from this group of elite into the hands of everybody. And that total dislocation has changed everything. And I don't even think we've begun to explore the ethical, legal, moral challenges, and also, I suppose, business and commercial challenges that have come from that. It's like journalists are sitting there going, oh my God, my business model is destroyed. It's worse than that. Everything you know about journalism has to be reevaluated. And so right now, I think there's this massive opportunity that if we get it right, we go from being the owners, having monopoly on news, to being the managers of this overabundance of information, helping people tell their story, helping find it's 100 hours of video posted on YouTube every minute. Now in there's something really valuable, but it's probably only 2 minutes, right? So how do we get to that 2 minutes? We're given a better opportunity to find things more authentic and raw, but we need to stop being the gatekeepers and stop being the voice of God in front of the TV camera and find ways to work with the people that used to be our audience.
And how do you think that this has changed the experience for the audience? We're seeing on television news, for example, at the network level, I had this discussion with network level folks about putting video on that you might not be sure where it came from, but also the quality is very different. It's amateur video as we used to think of amateur video. Does that change the experience for the audience in terms of credibility?
I don't think so. I think the audience have got used to the idea that whatever they lose in quality, they gain in authenticity. So, as a war correspondent, I would be in a situation where I have a second account of an incident. I might film the incident, a bomb falling or someone shot dead. But, I've got to really work hard to get authentic views of that. Now, that same incident will be recorded 5, 6, 7 times. I will get so many different angles. I don't know if you remember last year, there was a meteor shower in Siberia. And in Russia, everybody has a dash cam for insurance purposes. We had 25 different videos recording the entire sequence. In Syria, we just did a documentary with the Young Turks Network about the barrel bombs that have been dropped by the Syrian authorities. And we have the entire sequence, a barrel bomb in a helicopter, a cigarette being used to light the fuse, it being dropped, and then a whole series of different views of the destruction it causes. And I can tell you, as a person who has been in war zones, we have never had that happen. We've never had that ability to see in real time. If Srebrenica, if Auschwitz, if Rwanda was happening today, the world could not say it didn't know. So think about that, the impact on history. And that's why, for me personally, this is the golden age, but it also requires us to change our complete attitude. And we've got to be thinking about how people want to consume that. People may not want to see raw violence. I understand that. But we've got to help them to say, this is what's significant behind it. This is the context. I've watched that beheading video. You don't have to. But I'm going to tell you what happened there. And I think that's where we have to really negotiate our relationship with the audience. I remember reporting from the scene of a terrible tsunami in Asia in 2005 in a place called Banda Aceh, being literally in a sea of bodies, a field of bodies, and saying on air, words can't describe. Words can describe. And I think we have to give the audience the choice of what level they connect with these horrible events around the world, and sometimes inspirational events. We haven't solved that yet. So you're right to say, how do we look at this from the consumer's point of view, not us, We've got a printing press, the newspaper be ready at 8 o'clock in the morning so you can sit down to your coffee and consume it. That's not going to wash anymore.
Right. And that brings up another very important point, archiving. You have expressed a lot of concern about the loss of history, that we're not archiving these incredible events that are happening around the world. Going back to and way before the Arab Spring, but that was a time when we really saw an explosion of communication through social media, news output through social media. How do we save that?
I think this is one of the biggest questions we face. As I say, think about how history would be different if we had a social media D-Day. We have, I think, 3 photographs of the actual landing, and they were taken by a photographer who fell into the water and almost ruined the roll. He came out with 3, and that's literally it. Now we've got Saving Private Ryan, we've got accounts, we've got Ernie Pyle who was there on D-Day. Just imagine the richness of the archive of seeing what it was really like at that moment. The problem is, if we're working the way we are at the moment, that would all disappear. There will be politically motivated campaigns to take the videos off YouTube that nobody is stopping. The actual videos themselves are degraded. People may take them off because someone's come to buy, the content for historical documentaries. So about a third of the videos, I heard this from a New York Times journalist recently, from Iran, that protest I mentioned, have gone. And, if we have this chance to preserve for future generations a first in a humanity's time to actually document everything that's happening around us, and we don't grasp that and do something about it, we will not be forgiven by future generations. So the social networks won't do it because it's not their business to judge the value of different pieces of content. Their whole platforms are based on your fluffy cat video is just as important as your Arab Spring video. And I don't blame them, that's what they do. But they're looking for us to come and help them. And I think that's where a university, for example, like University of Florida, to say, okay, let's do a task. Can we do this? How do we download it? How do we tag it? How do we make sure that we may have a piece of video that we won't realize its value for 10 years? So can we tag it properly? Semantic web searches. There's so much science around this that, wow, I mean, if I could, I would give up what I'm doing and just spend next year in a basement with some really smart people here. Maybe not.
At least not in the basement.
Not in the basement.
We came up at a time, a slightly different time, but in terms of generations, your generation, my generation, that wasn't a thought. You had a job as a journalist, and that's all you needed to do. And you said at one point, I wish that when I had been in college more than 20 years ago, that I had learned that, because boy, did you need it when you started Storyful, and the challenges that go along with running this huge business. It becomes corporate. So talk a little bit more about what your thoughts are as far as that goes.
Well, first of all, I would say journalists are great entrepreneurs in one sense, because we're used to standing up in front of an audience and persuading them of the truth, even though we don't believe it necessarily sometimes, right? So, you got to get up there and you're live on air and the teleprompter's gone and you've got another 2 minutes to fill and you just keep going. And that's a great trait to have when you're standing in front of a bunch of investors who don't believe a word you're saying. And you just keep going. Or when you're going into your staff and you don't have the money to make payday and you got to tell them everything's great and you got to lead them. So there is a certain sense of managing contradictions and pressure and stress, communication, that really make you a better entrepreneur. But the problem is this: we as journalists, we hate failing. So there's no way we want to make a mistake. And we're paranoid about getting something wrong on air, and that makes us terrible entrepreneurs, because the whole concept of being a startup person is fail quickly, learn your lesson, get better. There's a great Samuel Beckett quote that I love quoting in this context. He said, ever tried, ever failed, no matter, try again, fail better. And I love that notion that you try things, and you might fall on your face the first time, but you'll learn from that lesson, get up, do it better. And with a group of people who do that quickly and iterate very quickly, that's how great companies are born. Try that in the newsroom. Go up to your managing editor, right? And say, you know what I want to do? I want to take 2 weeks just to try and fail, right? And that's not going to be something that's going to go down well. It's changing, but that's why I had to start my company outside a big news organization. I was so unprepared, by the way. I've only had 2 jobs in my life. One was 24 years in RTE, this station, and then I was with this startup I founded. My first day, I had a whiteboard, just myself, and a laptop, and a permanent marker, which I went to draw on the whiteboard, and then spend the rest of the day wiping it off, thinking, did Bill Gates ever do this? I was so naive about business. I didn't know what P&L meant. So I had my MBA the hard way.
You did. I want to rewind to something you were talking about just a little bit ago, when you were talking about the relationship between the techies and the journalists, and they're innately sort of different beasts. Some people would say, but the journalists should be able to do it all themselves. They should code. And you have said journalists don't need to code. And probably half of the audience now is collectively sighing relief that they don't need to learn to do that. Talk a little bit about that and really how you think that should work in terms of partnership and who should be in charge of which pieces of the puzzle.
I remember sitting on a stage about a year ago at a conference, a big TV news conference, and there was a guy beside me, and I won't name him, he's a great guy, but he got up and said, listen, and he pulled out his bag, and he had 16 different mobile phones, and he had 16 different SIM cards, and he had Google Glass on him, and he went and told every single one of you should know Ruby on Rails, and we all looked at him, and I remember thinking, you're an idiot. I mean, like, what's more important is to have shorthand, right? What's more important is to have a headline writing skill. Like, these are the things that teach us how to tell stories briefly. And then the only thing I need to know about my iPhone is what behavior it unlocks, what ability for me. My first story was I covered a plane crash in Amsterdam in 1990, and I had to run up and down the stairs of this tower block looking for a rotary phone to phone in my report. Now, that iPhone that's in my hand is for me a liberation, and I want to go to that 23-year-old guy and say, it doesn't matter if I understand how this phone works, as long as what I'm saying in the phone is quality, is journalism. So I'm very much of the opinion that we need to understand technology's impact on our behavior. But this is not a technological revolution we're living through, it's a cultural revolution. Because these great machinery that we use are allowing us to do things we could never have thought of possible. So I don't think you need to code. I do think you need to understand data journalism. If any of you guys can't use an Excel spreadsheet, these are things you need to learn. How do I group data? How do I spot patterns in data sets? And the general principles of how communities form. So it's almost like a social study as opposed to a technology study. They're the things that I think journalists should understand. And most important, they should learn the value of engagement and humility. So I'd much rather journalists understand how to talk to an ordinary person than how to, you know, code a new website. That's my personal preference. But I sound like I'm 46, so I sound really old when I say that.
No, that's okay. We agree with you. I think they agree with you too.
Thank you.
Let me ask you about niche journalism. We spoke briefly about this in an earlier conversation, and I wanted to kind of come back to this idea of students having their own brands, because my experience, and many of us as educators, we're finding that we're sending students out into a world where they don't necessarily have that full-time job. They have a lot of small bites that sort of build a career for them. And you had, I thought, some great thoughts about how students can make that work, what they need to do to, you said not even survive, but to thrive, living that way. What is your advice to our young journalists?
I said part of the problem is when you're a journalism student, you're always looking at kind of the last ways of innovation for your guide, right? So right now, everyone wants to be BuzzFeed, everyone wants to be Vox, everyone wants to be Mashable and Vice, right? That's great. They're great organizations. We work with them. I love them. But they're not the future. It'll all be something new now by the time you guys graduate. But think about the current age of digital content in 3 stages. We started to have these content farms called demand media, associated content, and what they would do is you'd be sitting at home, they'd pay you $25 to produce, you know, 200 words about Valentine's Day. And that's the way it was. And it was a low cost, low quality job. Then we had like the gawkers of the world who came in and hired freelancers and young people to basically chase clicks. So if you got 1 million clicks on your story, huge success. Now, if people are staying for 2 seconds on average, they didn't care because clicks were where it was at. We're now in this really interesting phase where advertisers and publishers are realizing if you get 50,000 clicks and it lasts for 10 minutes, that level of engagement can now be sold at a premium rate to advertisers. So the business model is shifting from quantity to, maybe not quality, but to niche. So for example, if you're, you know, an extreme sports fanatic, you now know you can go to a whole multitude of sources of people you respect and you understand who are just like you producing content. And I think that's what's going to happen. We're going to get more and more people demanding quality content in more and more niches with more and more engagement. And I think that's where the future of our business is. So rather than thinking, you know, your next job is going to be a, you know, unpaid internship at some big publication with 20 million views, it could well be that you and a couple of friends become the definitive cultural blog for Gainesville. and you find a way to have subscribers, you find a way to have advertisers at a premium rate, you find a way to do events, you do offline activity, you become, you know, experts for other places. You hit the nationals by basically feeding in a regular feed from the area. I think we've got to think more entrepreneurial in your future. It's not to say you won't get hired by a big news company, but I can tell you right now, the people that I'm hiring are people who've done something like this. We have the biggest bunch of misfits and people who've gone off, and I asked someone last week what they did before they joined Storyful, and they were like, yeah, well, you know, I used to make shoes. This person came to us from another news organization. I think just basically thinking about journalism as more of a niche product aimed at engagement with a very much more segmented industry and market, as opposed to appealing to the wide common denominator. And the final thing is categories are gone. So news, sports, entertainment, they were all our constructs as journalists. People don't consume media like that. I mean, I don't know about you, but I mean, I'll tweet out a link to Foreign Policy magazine next to a picture of the aurora borealis that I really like, or a cute cat, or my daughter playing on a swing. So I think we have to understand there's a lot more breadth of people looking for a lot more things and a lot more specialist quality content. That's what I think, basically.
Mm-hmm. And that makes sense, given that we have a greater social nature, I think, by virtue of the fact that technology allows that.
It also lets you scale
we're all
it, yeah.
over the place.
Exactly, and if you thought about 10, 20 years ago, you know, like the alt weeklies that came through America, I remember every city had an alt weekly, and it was great. It was like a chance for us to break out of the media establishment. But that cost a lot of money to go to a printing press. Now you can set up an alt weekly, I would argue, for a fraction of the cost, with an exponential scope for getting readers and people coming in and talking to you, and offering you content as well. So the barriers of entry to the business of blogging and publications are just so low, and the capacity to reach an audience that's so much bigger is so much greater. And if we can't make this work, guys, I mean, we don't deserve to be journalists. I mean, I think there's, I know that sounds, I'm not diminishing the difficulties we face, but there's an opportunity here that's just, and I don't think the business model is fully evolved yet, so hopefully this generation will push it along.
I think they will. This is a very exciting time.
It is. It's the most exciting time. Again, I'm not diminishing in any way the experience of people who are in newspapers fearing for their jobs. I don't undermine that at all. But I tell you something, if you just take a look at all the potential we have to tell better stories more quickly, with more authenticity to a bigger audience, never in the history of humanity has there been a chance like this.
I'd like to switch gears slightly, and this might put some journalism professors in a bit of a tizzy. But you have said that you agree with Jay Rosen, who has written a book titled The Voice from Nowhere, which really challenges the premise that journalists can ever be truly impartial. And he does not believe that's the case. And we all sort of carry around our, we pull around our little baggage wagon of life's experiences with us everywhere we go. So that is a challenge to try to teach objectivity and impartiality. You say, I agree, maybe journalism needs to take a little bit of a turn. What do we teach these students not to be objective, not to be impartial?
No, but I think
if
you think about the development of the live shot, the dictatorship of the live shot in local television and national television news. So you're a reporter and you're on the scene and you don't get a chance to investigate a report because your TV station wants you right there to comment, not to report, but to comment. And I think that began as sort of a slow, almost tumor within what we were doing, where basically all of us, when we were 21 years old, we were asked to give our opinions almost. And I remember this in war zones where, I remember being in a hotel in 2006 in South Lebanon, and we just sat by the pool and by our live shots to wait for the hit. And all the information we were getting was from rumor, and sometimes we phone back to Atlanta or New York or Dublin and say, what's the Associated Press saying about where I am? And then at 5 o'clock, the Hezbollah would fire a rocket, the Israelis would come back and hit the olive grove, and we'd all stand up and do our live shots. Now that was the good old days, supposedly. So I think when live, and not just live, but also when digital came in and newspaper correspondents also have to do the same thing, was file constantly, they lost their ability to do the deep reporting that I think is what we should primarily be responsible for. And the reporting of fact doesn't have a yes or a no. If you discover a fact that you know objectively to be a fact, what are you going to do? Do you have to get another counter argument to balance that out?
Some would say yes.
Why? If it's a fact, if you know it to be a fact. If it's not an opinion is different. But we live in this age of, fair and balanced. Yeah, right. Look where that got you. And I'm just saying that if I, for example, know that in Ukraine today there is a terrible tragedy, am I going to go in there and all I'm going to do is say the Russians say this and the Ukrainians say this? Is that what I do? If I'm doing that, I'm failing as a journalist. If I go in and say, I am going to deep dive into this story and find as many facts as I can and present them, and I may not have 100% of the picture, but I'm going to actively go and try to find the truth, even if it contradicts an opinion. And I think too often we don't do that. Too often you see in Gaza recently was a classic example. You go to Europe and it's the Israelis, look at them, what they're doing, it's terrible. You're in the United States and you say, look at Hamas, look what they're doing, it's criminal. And we all tend to kind of back that consensus view, whether you're European or an American. Whereas if you went in and said, I'm just going to slowly categorize exactly what's happening in terms of the impact, the suffering, the devastation, the impact on Israeli society, like that's a much better job of work than getting up and saying, on the one hand, Benjamin Netanyahu says this, and on the other hand, Hamas say this, and I think we got lost there around the time that live television took over.
Interesting. So what do we, as professors, to sum that up in terms of what we teach, how do we teach that? How do you explain that to young journalists? What do they take with them?
I think the question is, what do you want to be when you're a journalist? I think there's going to be an emergence of broadly two parallel types of journalists. So on the one hand will be the people that used to sit in newsrooms listening to the police scanner. And they'll be, in the words of today, a group I was working with, the kind of the citizen media assignment desk. The people who'll be watching out for what's coming out of social networks very quickly and assessing it and doing a kind of a first pass at filtering it. And then behind them, I think, will be the people who will be the analysts and the storytellers who will take these raw pieces of content and combine them with the original content they provide and give this sort of an analysis. And I think that's the way things will go. I always love breaking news, but then I loved analysis, and I was caught between the two. And I think this is what's going to happen to most of the journalists in the room. They will find themselves in big newsrooms where the social media people are in the middle, like the police scanner. And then as you fan out, you get to your speciality desks, and everybody's going to be feeding off that raw feed and adding context and layers of meaning and hopefully better journalism, because it'll liberate the people like me who'd be in South Lebanon who wanted to go with the Red Cross into the hills for 2 days but couldn't. So I kind of feel that's the way it'll divide. It'll be the eye in the sky, watching out for the stuff coming up, and then the people on top of that adding the meaning, the context, the stories.
You have developed a 10-point list of Storyful's 10 commandments, so to speak. One of them being there is always someone closer to the story. Another being we kill hoaxes. And you've spoken about that a bit already. But I'm curious, how many hoaxes do you kill? How much hoax is posing as truth in this soup of information that's coming in to the media from other places?
It's a great question. I think, increasing amounts of hoaxes are coming out in every story. So it ranges in a spectrum, right? So on one hand, you've got like people who think it's funny to post pictures of a hurricane from 5 years ago. At the moment, the hurricane is striking now. And I don't know why they do it. I think it's more to do with the fact that rumor and gossip, have always been valued by people. They love bitching about the neighbors. I think there's the same kind of malicious kind of intent here to be the first with something that fools other people. That can be easily knocked down because there's never been a quicker fact-checking mechanism, ironically, than the exact same platforms that's shared on. So we can battle that. It's a battle, but we can get there quickly. The second type is much more sinister, and that is politically motivated hoaxing and misinformation. To give you an example, we just had a recent incident where a bunch of pro-democracy activists in Hong Kong were trying to arrange a demonstration in commemoration of Tiananmen Square. And they used Chinese characters to get past the censor. And they suddenly found this group of anonymous activists who came at them saying, Al-Qaeda will be at that demonstration, it's unsafe, there'll be a bomb. Now it turned out that it was actually state-sponsored bloggers who had been, and not even officially from the state, but groups of online activists who either financially or ideologically are attacking pro-democracy activists. It happens in Bahrain, Iran, it happened in Egypt, it's happening as well in Syria. So that's the more sinister kind of arms race between people using the social web as a form of freedom of expression and governments that are waking up to the fact that they can't turn the internet off. So, hey, let's embrace it and let's use it to be a propaganda tool. And that's where I'm really worried. I think we're developing a really difficult time. And I think also the third aspect is governments becoming, I wouldn't trust a politician to legislate for the internet in a heartbeat. remember being on a politician on a talk show once recently. He said, I said, the Twitter. And this is a person who's responsible for legislating in the European Union. So yeah, no, I think these are all of the problems we have right now. The people who understand the social web are probably the people who are farthest away from legislating.
Mm-hmm. I think we probably have a lot of questions from the audience that we'll be taking in just a minute,
Great.
But I wanted to ask you one more before we get to that. Let's talk about the issue of journalists and safety.
Ooh.
A very serious issue. There are very dangerous parts of the world where journalists go and they take incredible risks, and the news as an industry sometimes encourages that. What is the answer?
Well, I think the first thing is just move beyond the news for a moment, and the nature of warfare and covering warfare has changed dramatically in the past 20 years. So, you know, when I started in journalism going to foreign conflicts, there was a front line and a front line, right? And, you know, you knew whichever way you covered, there was going to be a person with a gun and you stayed out of that person's way. And then suddenly after 9/11 and the arrival of Islamist ways of combat, you know, you suddenly found you were a target. So I remember being in Iraq in 2003, and an Australian friend of mine was killed by a bomb attack because his car had TV. We used to put TV and sticker and sort of duct taped on top of the car, so if a helicopter or a drone or anyone came above, they'll see you're a television camera person. But suddenly, because there was value in killing a journalist, we all had to scrape this off all the cars. And that was my first moment thinking things have changed. A journalist is now essentially a combatant in the eyes of certain people. A random turn the wrong way down a road, and you drift into the wrong place, you know, it's all over. And going back to Baghdad, I remember several times where just increasingly we had to do bizarre things to protect ourselves from the people we were trying to cover, not from the people who were fighting the battle. So that's the first thing that happened. It became ultimately more dangerous, and the statistics are showing more journalists dying. But the problem you're describing is really horrible because, you know, I used to get trained. I was sent by my organization to the SAS, former SAS people who are the kind of the special services in Britain. We'd go to an army base for a week. They would practice kidnappings, first aid on us, and then we'd be sent off. And that must have cost tens of thousands of dollars. Now you're seeing a lot of freelance journalists who see in Syria and these places like Iraq a chance to break into the international media. And because obviously everyone wants content but won't send their own people, they're relying on people like the late James Foley. And people who are being sent into war zones with great talent, ambition, stamina. And if you read some of the reportage he had beforehand, far worse than anything I would ever have faced, or the old generation of foreign correspondents. But the problem is because he's freelancing, who's paying his insurance bill? Who's going to get him out of there if there's going to be an abduction? If he's French, he'll happen to have a government that will pay a ransom, which in itself is a problem. If he's American, he won't. And I just, you know, for me personally, it's one of those things that news organizations say, well, what can we do? That's not a response, you know. So either you don't use freelance correspondence and you ban the use of any content coming out of a war zone that you don't know where it came from and you can't stand over the source, or you create a fund that helps protect and perhaps train and perhaps give protective gear and, you know, simple things that we would do to avoid abduction. I don't think are being trained with the people who are going out there. And the final part of the puzzle is we used to have fixers on the ground that would make us look good. We'd always have a translator or someone well educated who spoke English and another language. Increasingly they are replacing the correspondents that won't travel to war zones, and increasingly they're paying with their lives. And increasingly we're seeing that they have nowhere to go. So I've lost some friends who were translators, and it's only been the philanthropic efforts of the journalists that work with them that have managed to get the money to their families to help them through the bereavement to make sure there was a standard of living. So I'm not blaming, I mean, the thing is there's no one to blame here but the industry. Because, you know, we've got to think about ways of creating a whole new way of dealing with the fact that people out there are 24-year-olds, whereas previously was someone who had 6 wars behind them. And that's just the change in the business. But we can't put our head under the sand. It's got to be confronted.
It's a different ball game.
Absolutely.
We are going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll take questions from the audience.
After almost 2 years, jury selection for the Pedro Bravo murder trial began today.
According to a UN spokesman, the current situation in Syria is the most significant.
So many residents have learned the case over the last
I'd say the most important thing about the INC is that it lets me actually get hands-on experience. So that's what an employer is going to be looking for. Do you know how to do what I need you to do?
It is truly an extraordinary venue for both innovation and immersion.
We have 2 television stations, 3 radio stations, and a full functioning online news operation. Here, the newsroom is the classroom is the newsroom, and the beat can be the world. There's really no one else in the country that's doing it quite like this.
The INC and a lot of the teachers here really just help you develop as a journalist and really help you grow and learn what works, what doesn't. What do you need to do to be a successful journalist?
We are doing news coverage for an 18-county market. We're doing it on all platforms. It's a really unique way to be able to try out theories and to see how we can engage our audiences in a deeper way.
Because you'll have students from all different platforms and areas of the newsroom that by nature of this facility will come together and collaborate.
They're not just TV, they're not just radio, they're not just web. Everybody works together to crank out one superior product.
You come in, you do your work, and you know that you're creating a product that's going to probably change somebody's life.
Early yesterday morning for the start of our work week.
WRUF.com.
The Innovation News Center is a one-of-a-kind, 100-seat, real-world working newsroom at the College of Journalism and Communications at the University of Florida. Find us at jou.ufl.edu.
One could say that Frank was planned, but one could also say that Frank emerged.
We want to bring people together who have that socialization experience, who learn from each other, but ultimately are going to leave here and do something with it. And so at some point the conversation's going to stop and it's going to turn into action.
It's learning that allows you to get to the next stage. It's learning that allows you, a whole system, to move forward in a way that is productive.
Deep understanding of the adaptive responses that are all around the world.
Nothing. Tell me about it. I love things I know nothing about.
We are, as humans, 99.955 exactly the same.
A language that uses science to reach the emotional and rational gateways that drive personal enlightenment and social progress.
And these cognitive biases drive us to focus on certain kinds of problems.
One of the things that I think is built into Frank is the sense that we are all part of a larger community.
There's been a real passion and a real appetite for people to come together and really think about public interest more deliberately as an industry.
And I think we've got everything we need right here. And if we think about the connections and the networks we'll make when we leave here, we're the ones that we've been waiting for. This is what we need for the journey ahead.
Join the community of people who are using communications to drive change. Frank is meeting in Gainesville, Florida, February 25th through the 27th, 2015. Find us online at frank.jou.ufl. The Innovators series, discussing how new technologies are changing the way we engage people, is brought to you by the College of Journalism and Communications at the University of Florida and the Knight Foundation.
And welcome back to the Innovators series. This is the part of our show where we'll be taking questions from the audience for Mark Little, who is the founder of Storyful. And our first question, could you tell me your name, please?
Jessica.
Jessica, hi, what is your question?
Hi, thank you first off for being here and sharing with us. My question lies in how you define social media. On your website, you state that you are the world's biggest media brands trust Storyful to discover, verify, and acquire social media for their storytelling. And as you were speaking, you use social media as an adjective and as a verb and as a noun, and it doesn't really follow, I guess, the Webster's Dictionary cookie cutter. So how would you define it?
That's a great question, and I constantly come up against this problem. It's like tying your shoelaces, right? It's very hard to come up with language to describe how you tie your shoelaces. You have to show it to a kid. You know, I teach my 7-year-old at the moment to do it. And it's just like with social media. So we talk about UGC, user-generated content. That's a horrible phrase. I wish we just, and we call it eyewitness media now among the people I work with, or citizen media, citizen journalism. There's no such thing. It's not a big bunch of people out there who are actively going out creating stories. There are eyewitnesses, there are activists. So I think part of the problem we have is definitions. At some point, social media will just become media. At some point, social journalism will become journalism. And I think we're just in this point of transition where we're struggling to find words to describe it. For my money, I would define social journalism, if you can put it that way, as journalism that starts and ends on the social web, on platforms as far afield as Twitter and Facebook and Instagram in the West, to Weibo and Youku in China, to VKontakte in Russia. Doesn't matter what the platform is, as long as it's where people are sharing content. That's what I think social journalism is. Use it as a source. You put it through your news organization, you might put it on your front page or in your broadcast, but eventually it's going to end up back in the social web. So that's how I define social journalism. Social media, I'd love to just stop using that phrase and, you know, just talk about media, you know. But you're right to point out the contradictions.
Well, there weren't really contradictions. It's just, as you were stating, there's no clear-cut, cookie-cutter definition for social media. Exactly. What social media means to me is not the same, obviously, to you. So how do we make that distinction, I guess, in the industry?
That's a good point. I think if you're defining it, and I haven't really searched for an answer to this because you can kind of feel it's understood by the people around you, which is a big mistake. The more you think you've solved a problem, the more you're not thinking about the right problem. In this case, I would define social media as a place where us as journalists are no longer needed as mediators. So if you think about a radio show or a newspaper or a television station, you know, it needs people like us to make it work. Social media is where nobody needs us, right? Now, they do actually need someone to come in and jump and help them trust, but they don't need anyone between the producer and the consumer. To give you an example, I don't know if you remember Commander Hatfield, who was an astronaut on the space station. He was up there for, I think, 3 months, and he produced the most amazing images from his laptop and his cameras, directly beaming it down to Earth to be consumed by us, without anybody, NASA, journalists, being in the way. That would be my definition of social media.
Thank you.
I just made that up, by the way.
It works. It sounds great. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. We'll take a question from this side of the audience. Tell us who you are and your question.
Hello, my name is Danielle Prince, and first I want to thank you for being here. Before you mentioned something about political hoax and politicians actually controlling what goes out there, what we see, but what about when you have governments that actually monitor? Italy, they actually own their own news organizations. In China, they censor the web. So how do we as journalists combat that?
It's a great question. I mean, remember, by the way, that when we talk about the good old days when everything was great and social media wasn't eating away at the fabric of our journalism, great example in Italy, right? So RAI is the state broadcaster, and it used to divide up its TV stations by the communists, the Christian Democrats, the socialists, and then the others. And all the programming was done that way. The news was done that way. Even in Britain, if you look at the tabloid newspapers and the broadsheets, they're all one political motivation or other. And we have Fox, we've got MSNBC here. So there's always been political bias in media. The difference now is transparency. I think what's happening more and more is politicians are being caught out. Authority figures, NFL players are being caught out in ways that they wouldn't have happened before. So I think we're having the capacity to call BS on our leaders is growing. Our capacity to see what they do in private is growing. Our capacity to, you know, see when they're being inauthentic is growing. But equally, their power to try spin things, control media, be first out there, use anonymous supporters to try and troll other people, that's growing as well. So just as you think you solve one problem, and you know, speaking truth to power is that great definition of journalism. It's never been easier to do it, but it's never been easier for power to manipulate mass media to spread a counter message. So in many ways, that's going to define what we can do going forward is us, people, I hope in this room, believe in freedom of expression with transparency without political bias. We'll be fighting a bunch of people that now have tools in their hands to spread propaganda.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll go back to this side of the room. What is your name and your question?
My name is Alyssa Jazel, and I am wondering, going back to the point you made about
politicians, governments using social media in a sinister way. I just started my thesis on advertisers and companies using social media in a sinister way. The example that kind of got me thinking about this is over the summer before Shark Week, there was a video that was uploaded to YouTube that looked like it was just uploaded by Jane Doe, and it was this very scary shark in a Canadian lake. And it turned out that the public went crazy, the local politicians had to shut down the lake, it was a mess. And turns out it was the Discovery Channel planting that video to generate buzz about Shark Week. And even the mayor, they didn't know. So I was wondering if you had any experience with that or any thoughts about where that line is drawn?
That's a great question. A couple of things. The first, I'm seeing more and more mass media who say, it was on the internet. It's okay, So we came across this video, which I think you've all seen last year, which was a woman upside down twerking, right? You remember this? So you all know the story. She falls down, she hits a candle, she sets herself on fire. And it goes bananas. It goes so viral. And there was one person sitting in our newsroom that day going, that's not right. She falls here, the candle's here, she set a fire here. The camera stops dead on the original. How would it do that if she's on fire? A variety of things didn't make sense. So we called BS and we went out and we said, no, we think this is wrong. Turns out Jimmy Kimmel made the video for no purpose other than to say he could. And it was just kind of like, and I was sitting there looking and going, that's so, not immoral, it's amoral, right? It's like as if hoaxing the nation is something you should be proud of. And we all kind of laughed in that kind of embarrassed way, I think, when we saw it. And I think that's what's happening. It's going away, I think. I think people are starting to say, well, wait a minute. If I put on an unverified image and say it's unverified, that doesn't mean I should have broadcast it. A lot of people are waking up to that fact. The second sort of stupid use of social media by brands is like the other day on 9/11, we saw these crazy product placements by companies with never forget. SpaghettiOs put a famous tweet out last year commemorating Pearl Harbor, right? I mean, this is senseless stuff. So I think we're in the early age where brands and news organizations are understanding that they have a responsibility and that it's not just good enough to say it's on the internet. But I think going forward, there's a lot of good things that are being done by governments and by brands and by NGOs and activists who are, governments are forming digital units to promote their humanitarian work. The British Foreign Office is employing a lot of former activists and humanitarian workers to try and create digital messages around their work they're doing. Right now, AFRICOM, the US troops are going to help the Ebola crisis. I guarantee that a lot of digital media will be around that, will hopefully educate people as to why US taxpayers' dollars are being spent to help people in that area. So a lot of good things can be done. Brands are doing a lot more content marketing around just subjects they like innovation, inspiration. So it's not all bad, but some of it is just like ridiculous. So I kind of sometimes, we keep a log in our office of all the stupid things we've seen people do on social media. So.
I might contact you about that.
Definitely, yeah.
Paper.
Got a huge file.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm sure you could write a book on that alone.
Oh yeah, I mean, like stupid things people do on the internet, by Mark Little. And I've done them myself.
It would be a great read.
No, I remember my first experience. I was tweeting to a professor in a big journalism school in New York, and I said something about how angry he was. And he came back and said, wait, I'm not angry. And I said, he could hear me. I was on Twitter. I just couldn't imagine that somebody in New York could hear my tweet in Dublin. So I've done stupid things on the internet as well.
Everybody has, right? Our next question, could you tell us who you are, please?
Hi, I'm Sarai Cruz. I'm a public relations major. But I have a question. In recent events this summer in Ferguson, we had a lot of user-generated content. A lot of people tweeting from the actual, like a war zone, and that was happening in Ferguson. Yet there was a delayed response from big media, CNN, Fox. MSNBC was kind of early, but still it was late. So why is there still that, there was a lot of, it's not a hoax, it was actually happening, and there was a lot of witnesses. Why was there still a skepticism about going in and reporting on it, and why was there that delayed response in your opinion?
I think two things. First of all, I think news organizations are kind of slow to mobilize resources to a place where they don't see the potential for a scoop or for it to be ahead of the time. You know, I remember when I was Washington correspondent having to go to Columbine after that tragic shooting, and literally the whole plane was full of journalists from DC flying to Denver, you know, because there was a sense that you got there for the morning show. I know that sounds very Machiavellian, but that was the way things worked. I think maybe in Ferguson as well, the second thing came into play, which was, like, there's a lot of shootings by cops, and there's a lot of people who die that way, and there's a lot of cases where people are shocked, but they never get critical mass. And I think, you know, newsrooms go like, okay, someone's been shot by a police officer. Do you have video? No. Okay, well, it's not going to be page one lead tomorrow. But they don't understand that there might be another force at work. People stand up, and in an innovative way with social media, I don't think Ferguson would have hit the headlines without that being made into something different. Occupy Wall Street was another example, totally ignored by the media until it became a big story. I mean, there's a ton of stories right now that are being given an accelerant by social media. So I think that's part of the reason, you know, another shooting like this, another school shooting, another tragedy, another egregious abuse of power. You know, these are things that are so just taken for granted that it must have a different character for the newsrooms to wake up to it. And in this case, it was the amazing show of force captured in those amazing images, which many were Instagrams, or the video of the tear gas being fired at the Al Jazeera crew, or, you know, a hashtag that summed up frustration of people way beyond Ferguson. So that's what social media does. It's not the cause of a story to catch fire, but it is the accelerant that kind of like throws the petrol on it. And news organizations are quite slow sometimes to react to that. They'd rather have a talking head saying, no, it's not a problem, yes, it's a problem, because that fills airtime. It's much more expensive and difficult to have someone there digging up the truth.
And what a great thought, a great final thought to leave all of our journalism students with, to realize what a privilege it is.
Absolutely.
And how exciting it is to do what you've done for so many years, and the myriad experiences that no one else would ever have in any other profession.
But at the same time, the humdrum banal things are also the beautiful things as well. You know, being live on air when your earpiece falls out, or, you know, reporting on a community event that is so inspirational it once brings a tear to your eye. So it's not about just foreign corresponding, it's about just serving your community sometimes and covering the local dog show or the local fete or the state fair. I mean, there's so much inspiration all around you. Capturing those moments is our responsibility, and enjoying it as you go is kind of a side benefit.
Right. I have enjoyed our conversation.
Oh, so have I, Bridget. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great.
And I hope you have enjoyed our discussion with Mark Little. Thank you for joining us. And thank you, Dean Diane McFarland, for making this possible. And again, we thank the John L. and James S. Knight Foundation for its sponsorship of the Innovators series.
Thank you. Thanks, Bridget.
Mark, I think you've been the prototypical innovator.